Hello and welcome to this week's mythology class on the mythology of floods. I'm Dr. Breach Burke, and this is my course that I teach at the university level and elsewhere. And this particular class is going to be, we've been looking at mythology somewhat thematically. We are looking at some of the chronology of events. For example, we talked about Zeus's rise to power, and we talked about that war between the Titans. But now we've talked about creation, and as I had mentioned in the creation mythology class, that we are also going to talk about the flood and the implications of the idea of flood. Now, again, this particular course is geared towards the psychology of myth. So we're looking at not only these stories, as we discussed in the very first lecture, there may be elements of history to these lectures. It's quite possible that you have flood myths that represent an actual event, perhaps an actual flood in that particular area, which tends to be viewed as a world cataclysm, because you don't know the world beyond the area that you've seen. I mean, yes, a lot of the people from what is now Greece and Turkey and the Mediterranean area and Northern Africa, got on ships and they sailed amongst their areas, but many of them, say, for example, might not have known about China or about North America or about different places. So the world is, I think Joseph Campbell used to say, the world is kind of a three-layer cake, and that's what it is. Just like the view of the cosmos is that way. There were 7 planets, and they were kind of captured in a dome with the sky, and it's a cosmology and worldview that is taken literally to some degree, but it also has a meaning beyond the literal. Because when we are talking about the way in which we interpret things in consciousness, especially when we interpret sacred mythical events, they have a meaning that goes beyond that. And flood mythology is probably one of the greatest examples of mythology that what they represent is the idea of birth and rebirth. Okay, that you will see this theme appear over and over again, and in more places than in just stories of the flood. There are other places in the Odyssey, for example, where we definitely see this same theme of birth, rebirth. And so we want to talk about these myths with respect to that idea. So let me share with you the presentation that I have. And let me do slideshow. Okay, so we're going to talk in this particular lecture about certain flood myths from the Near East, because again, there's other stories from other cultures. We're focusing primarily on sort of Greek, Roman, Babylonian, Sumerian myths from this area. And so we're going to look at, we're going to read from 3, because the first 2 that are on this list are actually quite similar. They're almost the same. It's just you've got a different name for the individuals, but the gods involved are the same, and the story is the same otherwise. So we have an Akkadian, a Babylonian version of, that comes from Gilgamesh primarily. Then we have, which is the oldest version, from about the year 2100 BCE. Then we have the one from Eridu Genesis, which is the Sumerian version of probably that same story, which comes probably anywhere from 100 to 500 years later. But it's pretty much a retelling of the same story from a different part of that region. And then we have, really I should have these 2 flipped, because the Greek version is the one that's the next oldest, okay, from about 600 BCE. And then I say Hesiod and Ovid. I mean Greek. I say Greek, but when I talk Ovid, we mean Roman, and Greek and Roman in this case are very, very close. I'm going to read to you Hesiod's story of Deucalion and Pyrrha, which is the other flood myth. And then we'll look at the story in Genesis 5, which, if you haven't read your Bible lately, the Genesis 5 story might surprise you a little bit. So, okay, so let's look at each of these in turn. First, there's the story of Atrahasis and Utnapishtim. And this is the oldest one that we know of, referring to a flood. It's also in a text called the Enuma Elish, as well as the Gilgamesh. And there's a flood in this one that is sent by the god Enlil. because he is actually trying to wipe out mankind. Okay, he's trying to get rid of mortals. And but his brother, the god Enki, decides to warn the one pair of mortals, actually, Atrahasis and his wife, and warns them to build a boat, and or a chest. Sometimes they'll refer to it as a chest, other times as a boat, and they get into that. And they, as the floodwaters rise, they're able to float and get away from the problem. And in this case, the boat, after 7 days, lands on Mount Nisir. And then Atrahasis, whose name means extremely wise, then is later, when it's found that he survived the flood, he becomes Utnapishtim, because he's actually he becomes like one of the gods after surviving the flood. Okay, so, and of course, that's a name that means he found life. And referring to our Gods, Heroes, and Monsters text, I'm not going to read the whole text, because the Babylonian text, again, is not written in necessarily, the translation is not necessarily nice flowing English. So I'm just going to read just some parts of it. Okay, so this is the flood story from the Epic of the Gilgamesh, tablet 11. And he starts with, "Let me reveal to you a closely guarded matter, Gilgamesh, and let me tell you the secrets of the gods. Shuruppak is a city that you yourself know, situated on the bank of the Euphrates. That city was already old when the gods within it decided that the great gods should make a flood. There was Anu, their father, warrior Elil, their counselor, Ninurta was their chamberlain, and Nugi, their canal controller." Okay. Farsighted Ea swore the oath of secrecy with them, so he repeated their speech to a reed hut. And he says, reed hut, brick wall, listen, reed hut, and pay attention, brick wall. This is the message. Man of Shurupak, son of Ubaratutu, dismantle your house, build a boat. Leave possessions, search out living things. Reject chattels and save lives. Put aboard the seed of all living things into the boat. The boat you are to build shall have her dimensions in proportion. Her width and length shall be in harmony. Roof her like the Apsu, which is the sky. I realized and spoke to my master, Ea. I have paid attention to the words you spoke in this way, master, and I shall act upon them. But how can I explain myself to the city and the elders? Ea made his voice heard and spoke. He said to me, his servant, you shall speak to them thus. I think that Ilil has rejected me, and so I cannot stay in your city. And I cannot set foot on Ilil's land again. I must go down to the Apsu and stay with my master, Ea. Then he will shower abundance on you, a wealth of fowl, a treasure of fish, prosperity, a harvest in the morning, cakes, darkness in the evening, rain, wheat, and heaviness he will shine upon you. Okay, so we have this story. It says, country gathered about me. And this is clearly Atrahasis talking here. The carpenter brought his axe, the reed worker his stone, the young men carried the bitumen, the poor fetched what was needed. It's a good thing to silence your phone. On the 5th day, I laid down her form. Okay, so he talks about this building of this boat. And the things that he puts on it. It says the Anunnaki had to carry torches. They lit up the land with their brightness. The calm before the storm god came over the sky. Everything light turned to darkness. On the day the first tempest rose up, blew swiftly, and brought the term says flood weapon, and they're not, I guess the flood as a weapon, like a battle force. They passed over the people. No man could see his fellow, nor could people be distinguished from the sky. Even the gods were afraid of the flood weapon. They withdrew. They went up to the heaven of Anu. The gods cowered like dogs, crouched by an outside wall. Ishtar screamed like a woman giving birth. The mistress of the gods' sweet of voice was wailing. Has the time really returned to clay because I spoke evilly of the gods' assembly? How could I have spoken such evil in the gods' assembly? I should have ordered a battle to destroy my people. I myself gave birth to them. They are my own people, yet they fill the sea like fish spawn. The gods of the Anunnaki were weeping with her. The gods humbled sat there weeping. Their lips were closed and covered with scab. For 6 days and possibly 7 nights, which doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's what they say, the wind blew, flood and tempest overwhelmed the land. And when the 7th day arrived, the tempest, flood, and onslaught, which had struggled like a woman in labor, blew themselves out. The sea became calm, the Mbulu wind grew quiet, the flood held back. I looked at the weather, silence reigned, for all mankind had returned to clay. The floodplain was flat as a roof. I opened a porthole and light fell on my cheeks. I bent down, then I sat, then I wept. My tears ran down my cheeks. I looked for banks, for limits to the sea. Areas of land were emerging everywhere. The boat had come to rest on Mount Nimish. The Mount Nimish held the boat fast and did not let it budge. The 1st and 2nd day, the Mount Nimish held it. Well, you can see this is the tablet. It repeats it 3 times. When the 7th day arrived, I put out and released a dove. The dove went, it came back, for no perching place was visible to it, and it turned round. I put out and released a swallow. The swallow went and came back, for no perching place was visible to it, and it turned around. I put out and released a raven. The raven went and saw the waters receding, and it ate, preened, lifted its tail, and did not turn around. Then it says, then I put everything out to the four winds, and I made a sacrifice. Set a sorkinu offering on the mountain peak, arranged jars 7 and 7. Into the bottom of them I poured essences of reed, pine, and myrtle. The god smelt the fragrance. The god liked, like flies gathered over the sacrifice. As soon as the mistress of the gods arrived, she raised the great flies which Anu had made to please her. Behold, O gods, I shall never forget the significance of my lapis lazuli necklace. I shall remember these times, and I shall never forget. Let other gods come to the Sorkinu offering, but let Eel will not come, because he did not consult before imposing the flood and consign my people to destruction. As soon as Ili arrived, he saw the boat. He was furious, filled with anger at the Ijiji gods. What sort of life survived? No man should have lived through the destruction. Ninurta made his voice heard and spoke, and said to the warrior Enlil, who other than Ea would have done such a thing? For Ea can do everything. See, in this version, they're talking about, and in the Gilgamesh, it's Ea and not Anki. In the Enuma Elish, it's Anki, just to be clear. You are the sage of the gods, the warrior, so how could you fail to consult and impose the sage of the gods, oppose the flood, punish the sinner for his sin, but punish the criminal for his crime, but ease off, let work not cease, be patient, let not. Instead of imposing a flood, let the lion come up and diminish the people. Instead of a flood, let a wolf come up and diminish the people. Instead of imposing a flood, let famine impose and lessen the land. Instead of imposing a flood, let error rise up and savage the people. I did not disclose the secret of the great gods. I just showed Atrahasis a dream, and thus he heard the secrets of the gods. Okay. Now that the advice that prevailed was his advice, Enlil came up to the boat and seized my hand and led me up. He led my woman and made her kneel down at my side. He touched our foreheads and stood between us and blessed us. Until now, Utnapishtim was mortal, but henceforth Utnapishtim and his woman will be as gods are. Utnapishtim shall dwell far off the mouth of the rivers. Okay, so that is the abbreviated version of that story from the text. Okay, so this is the flood myth as we see it from ancient Babylon. And of course, as I mentioned, there's the Zia Sudra myth, which was written around the 1600s. And this was in the Eridu Genesis. Zia Sudra means of long days. And again, as you see the story, in this case, you have Anki warning him that Enlil is sending a flood. He builds a boat, lands after 7 days, and makes a sacrifice. I don't have the text of that one here, and there's no real reason to read it because it's really a repetition of what we see in Gilgamesh. So, but we see that the Sumerians probably borrowed from their neighbors, but it's a very similar story. But you have Utnapishtim, who also represents being of long days, and Zia Sudra. What you're going to find too with the flood stories from the Near East is that the idea of mortality is very much tied up in these stories, the idea of death coming to mortals. We're going to especially see this in the biblical version, which is the one we're going to read next. Now, I said Genesis 5. Where do I have that written? I have it written someplace where I said 5. It's actually Genesis 6 to 9, so I'm off by a chapter there. But let me read to you from Genesis. I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's very long, but I am going to read some parts of it because they're quite interesting. Okay. Genesis 6. When man began to multiply on the face of the ground and daughters were born to them, the sons of gods, okay, sons of gods, it's Pierre's first time here, saw that they were fair. And now, by the way, let me just stop for a minute. Sons of gods has often been interpreted as angels or angelic beings. If you read the book of Enoch, they're called the Watchers. We can assume for argument's sake that they are angelic beings, but they also may well be some other kinds of gods or spirits, because Judaism was not a monotheistic religion at this time. In fact, there's a lot of the Torah shows how they became a monotheistic religion. So you see a lot of references to the sons of gods or the council of gods. So here's one. Okay, so they saw the sons of the gods saw that they were fair, the women, and they took wives for themselves of all they chose. Then Yahweh said, "My spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh. Their days shall be 120 years. Okay, so Yahweh is basically declaring that there's some mortals in the Bible who live to be like, was it Melchizedek who lives, no, Methuselah, who lives to be like 900 years old. And it's like, and so Yahweh is now saying, okay, no, we're going to limit the lifespan of humans no more than 120 years. And the Nephilim were on the earth at that time. Okay, take note of that too. On those days and afterwards, when the sons of gods went into the daughters of human beings who bore children to them. These were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown. Okay, so when we move over to talking about the Greek sagas, the Trojan War, and these great battles of Greek heroes, it's interesting because this seems to be a reference to them. They're calling them the Nephilim. In other words, these are like godmen. They are, the Nephilim are often interpreted in other texts as a race of giants. So here we see in the Bible this idea of a race of giants that covers the earth. And they actually supposedly devour everything in their sight and destroy everything. But here in the Bible, they're saying, well, these were the warriors. So if and as we'll see, like Achilles, the great warrior Achilles, we see, we have, trying to think of some of the other ones, Aeneas. They usually have one mortal parent and one immortal parent. Hercules or Heracles. Okay, Zeus is the father, usually the father of these heroes. Although in Aeneas's case, his parent is his immortal parent is Aphrodite or Venus. So you'll see this interesting juxtaposition between these heroes that were thought of mythical proportions. They were part of these sons of gods. These were the offspring of what we'll just say for argument's sake of angels and humans. Okay. Yahweh saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And Yahweh was sorry that he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him in his heart. So Yahweh said, I will blot out from the earth the human beings I have created, people together with animals and creeping things and birds of the air, for I'm sorry that I've made them. But Noah found favor in the sight of Yahweh. Okay, so then they go and talk about the descendants of Noah, and then we'll skip over that. And he says, God says to Noah, I've determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence because of them, and now I'm going to destroy them along with the earth. Make yourself an ark of cypress wood, make rooms in the ark, cover it inside with pitch. This is how you are to make it. And then he goes into the whole thing about how many cubits it should be, which we don't need to discuss. For my part, I'm going to bring floodwaters all over the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh in which it has the breath of life. Everything is on earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark. You, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And of every living thing of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark, and keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Of the birds according to their kinds, and of the animals according to their kinds, of every creeping thing on the ground according to its kind, 2 of every kind shall come into you to keep them alive. Also take with you every kind of food that is eaten and store it up. It shall serve as food for you and for them. Noah did as God commanded. Okay. Genesis 7, Yahweh then says to Noah, go into the ark and all your household, for I've seen that you are alone and righteous before me in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and its mate, a pair of the animals that are also not clean, the male and its mate. And he goes on and he explains that, and he says, in 7 days I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and every living thing I have made will blot out from the face of the ground. Noah was 600 years old. It's quite a task when the flood waters came on the earth. And Noah with his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives went to the ark to escape the waters of the flood. Okay, and they talk about the beings on the ark. It's mainly a repetition of what was just said before. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, on that day, all of the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. The rain fell on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. Okay, so now we have a different number here. On the same day, Noah with his sons, Shem and Ham and Japheth, and Noah's wife and the 3 wives of his sons entered the ark, they and every wild animal and kind, and all domestics of every kind. Okay. And so, so this is just a repetition. Again, I don't feel like rereading the same stuff. The flood continued for 40 days on the earth. The waters increased, bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters swelled and increased greatly on the earth. The ark floated on the face of the waters. The water swelled so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. The water swelled above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep, and all flesh died that moved on the earth. Birds, domestic animals, wild animals, swarming creatures, and all human beings. Everything on dry land whose nostrils was the breath of life died. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground. Only Noah was left and those that were in the ark, and the waters swelled for 150 days. Okay, Genesis 8. But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and domestic animals with him in the ark. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed. Rain from heavens was restrained. The waters receded from the earth. At the end of 150 days, the water had abated. And the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. The waters continued to abate until the 10th month. And the 10th month, on the first day, the tops of the mountains appeared. At the end of the 40 days, Noah opened the window that he had made and sent out the raven. It went to and fro until the waters were dried up from the earth. He then sent out the dove from him to see if the waters had subsided from the face of the ground. But the dove found no place to set its foot and returned to him in the ark. But the waters were still on the face of the whole earth. So he put out his hand and took it and brought it to the ark with him. He waited another 7 days, and again he sent the dove out from the ark. And the dove came back to him in the evening, and in its beak was a freshly plucked olive leaf. So Noah knew the waters had subsided from the earth. He waited another 7 days, sent out the dove, and it did not return to him anymore. Finally, Noah, on the 601st year, the first month. So this seems like this is about a year. It's just weird because it's like 40 days, 40 nights, then it's 150, then it's a year. It's kind of strange. Noah removed the covering of the ark, looked around, saw the face of the ground was drying. In the 2nd month, on the 27th day, the earth was dry. Then God said to Noah, "Go out of your ark, and your wife and your son's wives with you, and to bring everything on the boat," basically. Then Noah built an altar to Yahweh and took of every clean animal and every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when Yahweh smelled the pleasing odor, Yahweh said in his heart, "I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. Nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease." And then God blessed Noah and his sons and said, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." Okay, that's where the story ends. So if we look at the notes that I have here, he wipes out this race of giants or heroes created by humans and angels. The term there used is Elohim for mating. And of course, he warns Noah. And this is the story that we typically know. Of course, the Noah story is followed by some rather questionable things about needing to repopulate the human race. So Noah's daughters getting him drunk and lying with him, and so on and so forth. It's it's a rather interesting solution to the problem, I guess. But I want to mention, as part of this, I want to talk about, so we see this story, and if we think about the story before, you have the raven and the dove that go out, you have this idea of the boat, you have the idea of all things being wiped out. In the Old of the Virgin, everything's returned to clay. Here it's just everything dies, and then it takes this very, very long time for all the waters to recede, and then Noah's able to release these things, just as Atrahasis / Utnapishtim does in the previous story, and of course Ziusudra in the Sumerian story. It's just the amount of time. The Babylonians condense it a great deal. They say this is 7 days. This story, it takes a lot longer. Okay. And finally, we've got the third flood myth we're going to talk about, which is the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha. Now Deucalion, one of the things we have not talked about here, and sometimes I put it in, sometimes I don't, but is the story of Prometheus. There are two brothers. They are the sons of Iapetus. If you recall, Iapetus was the Titan associated with violent death and with mortality. Okay, Iapetus's sons had two sons, Prometheus and Epimetheus. And Prometheus means one who's very wise and clever, and Epimetheus basically means one who's pretty dumb. I mean, he doesn't, I guess the kinder way to put it was good judgment and faulty judgment is the way that their names are translated. And Prometheus ends up, making humankind and creating it. Okay, so he's the creator of humankind. But he's also always at odds with Zeus. One of the big things that he does is he's making a sacrifice to Zeus, and he basically, carves up an animal, and he kind of puts the sacrifice into two piles. One looks better than the other one, but the other one's really only bones and fat, and the other one is like the good meat. And so Zeus chooses the one that looks better and then realizes he's been deceived. So he punishes, well, he doesn't just punish Prometheus, he punishes humankind by taking fire away. But then Prometheus is able to steal fire from the sun, and it's sort of passed along in a reed, and then it's brought back to humankind. So when Zeus sees this, Zeus decides to have another kind of revenge. But instead of going after Prometheus, who's very clever, he goes after his brother Epimetheus, because he knows Epimetheus is probably going to screw up. So what Epimetheus does is he, they make Pandora. Pandora is like, she's like the most, basically means like universally adored is the name, Pandora. And, she's created by the god Hephaestus. She's actually crafted, and Aphrodite gives her certain attributes and things. She's like this beautiful woman created by Zeus. And he brings it to Epimetheus as a gift. Now, Prometheus has warned Epimetheus. He's like, don't accept any gifts from Zeus. Any gift you accept from Zeus is going to be, it's a you don't, there's going to be a trick involved. There's going to be something about it. But Epimetheus, being a faulty judgment and not being that smart, he sees Pandora and goes, wow. So he basically, he takes Pandora as his wife, and, but Pandora's given this little box, this little chest. And she has been told, under no circumstances are you to ever open this box. It's given to her by the gods. So, however, she's married to a man of faulty judgment, and she herself has curiosity. This is one example of the motif of the one forbidden thing that we'll see in folklore as well. You see it in the Adam and Eve story about, when, that one tree, you can touch any tree, just not that one. So that one, of course, becomes the one ultimately of the most interest. And here we have a case of, you have this box. Oh, you've got this box, but don't open it. What was in the Tale of Bluebeard? Don't look in that closet. There's always something about, people doing the one thing they're not supposed to do because of curiosity, they can't help themselves. So she opens this box, and what she ends up doing is letting out all plague, pestilence, and everything. So she brings death into the world and suffering of every kind. And as it's flying out like massively, like a swarm, she slams the lid shut. And what she keeps in the box is hope, the little spirit of hope. And scholars have really puzzled over what that means, because it's like, okay, if hope is the one thing that's not released into the world, it's almost like the idea, but on the other hand, you could look at it as hope is the one thing that hasn't escaped. Like even amongst all this, there's still the chance that hope is retained somewhere. It's an interesting question, but this is what we see in this particular story. So, and the reason we talk about Prometheus and Epimetheus here, and Prometheus, by the way, is punished by Zeus by being chained up in the underworld, and Prometheus is immortal. So it is an eagle that comes every day and pecks at his liver. Now you may say, well, why the liver? Well, because the liver among the Greeks was considered to be the seat of the soul. So it would peck his liver apart, and at the end of the day, it would rejuvenate itself, and then the eagle would start all over again. And this goes on until Prometheus is eventually rescued by Heracles during one of his labors. He actually does, Prometheus is finally allowed to leave. Prometheus also eventually exchanges his immortality with the wounded healer Chiron, because when Chiron is accidentally wounded by Heracles, he can't die, but he's suffering terribly. So there's like an exchange there, and there's a mortality. Wait, do I have that right? One of them's mortal. Prometheus is immortal, and Chiron. There's No, it's actually, I think it's that he wants to die, he's going to die, but then, Prometheus gives him the immortality, and then he's able to actually live. I should probably go back and reference that one. I'm pulling it off the top of my head and I'm going, something about the details of that doesn't seem right, but it is a story worth looking at because Prometheus does appear again there as well. Okay, Deucalion and Pyrrha. This is the next. Really, this one is actually 100 years before the Noah myth, at least the Noah myth as it was written down. One thing that's important to note is that we're looking at dates that these things were written down, not necessarily the dates that they were, they were originally told, okay, because it was a big, long oral tradition before there was writing. Now, this story of Deucalion and Pyrrha comes from Apollodorus's library. And also it's told in the Catalog of Women by Hesiod, which is the oldest version of it. The book that I have, Gods, Heroes, and Monsters, has Apollodorus's version, so I'm going to read that one to you. Prometheus had a son, Deucalion, okay? So this is where Prometheus and Epimetheus figure into this story. He ruled in the regions around Pythia and married Pyrrha, the daughter of Epimetheus and Pandora, okay? The first woman fashioned by the gods. And when Zeus was about to destroy the men of the Bronze Age, Deucalion, by the advice of Prometheus, constructed a chest and had storing it with provisions, embarked in it with Pyrrha. But Zeus, by pouring heavy rain from heaven, flooded the greater part of Greece so that all men were destroyed except a few who fled to the high mountains in the area. It was then that the mountains in Thessaly parted and that all the world outside the Isthmus and Peloponnese was overwhelmed. But Deucalion, floating in the chest over the sea for 9 days and as many nights, drifted to Parnassus, and there, when the rain ceased, he landed and sacrificed to Zeus Phyxios, Zeus of escape. And Zeus sent Hermes to him and allowed him to choose what he would, and he chose to obtain men. And at the bidding of Zeus, he took up stones and threw them over his head, and the stones which Deucalion threw became men, the stones which Pyrrha threw became women. Hence, people were called metaphorically people from Laos, stone. And Deucalion had children by Pyrrha, first Helen, whose father some say was Zeus, the second Amphictyon, who reigned over Attica after Cranios, and a third daughter, Protogenia, who became the mother of Athelios by Zeus. Okay, so they're going on to a chronology there. Now, there's another story. Hesiod's story is slightly different because what happens here is that Zeus makes this decision that he's going to wipe out, just as Yahweh did, the corrupt people of the Bronze Age. Bronze Age, too, by the way, is also like right around what Ovid calls the Age of Heroes. Okay, and so this is when so this Age of Heroes is when we have these Nephilim that the Bible talks about. There's this idea of the great Trojan War heroes and everything were Bronze Age heroes. So they said Zeus is going to send this flood to wipe out the corruption. Deucalion is warned by Prometheus. Okay, Prometheus once again warns his son what's going on. And so he takes his wife Pyrrha, they ride the storm out in this chest or this box, and they land on Mount Parnassus. Now, in the Hesiod version of the story, when they finally leave their little box or their chest, they realize that there's nothing there, and they're both despairing and heart-stricken, grief-stricken for the loss. So what they end up doing is they go to the ruins of a temple of Themis. Remember, Themis was the goddess of order, and they pray to her for an oracle. She is one of the oldest oracles listed, probably in the world from that region. And so what she does is she takes pity on them and she sends them the message, throw the bones of your mother behind you. And they go, and of course, Pyrrha is going, well, I couldn't insult my mother that way. Like, she's taking it very, very literally and superficially. But then finally they realize, wait a minute, the earth is our mother and the stones are her bones. So then they start picking up the rocks and throwing them over their shoulder. And as they do, people start appearing. So they thus repopulate the earth. Okay, so here's the stories as they are right now. Let me just stop the share of that. I want to share something else with you right now. Here we go. Okay. Yeah, let's move this up so you can see it. Flood myths in the Near East. Okay, so this is just basically a chart, which I will provide to you, of the different, kind of a summary of the different flood myths, where their sources, what the basic storyline is, and so that you can see side by side a summary of how all of these fit together. And as you see, what I'm calling the Hebrew or biblical version is the newest, not the oldest. Okay, and the similarities are fascinating. Now, what I want to do now is I want to turn to a story that I have because again, we're talking about the sort of psychological nature of this. Around the first time I ever taught this course was around time of Hurricane Sandy, because I remember the first semester that I taught this, my midterm had to be put off to something like late November because nobody had power, internet, could drive anywhere. You know, it was that was in 2012, and Sandy was quite catastrophic in its results. So in the wake of this, the New Yorker published an article by Avi Steinberg, and the article is called "Ancient Fears: The Return of the Flood Saga." So I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to read some of it to you. And if you can find this article, it's an interesting read. So this is Steinberg. He says, "In the past week or so, I have, with only a few reservations, become a fan of the Weather Channel. They talk about the jets. Their talk about the jet stream is truly mesmerizing. I love how they address each other by the honorific doctor. Unlike most talking heads, they bring together legitimate experience with something actually useful to say. Okay, it's a bit tacky how excited they were to break records as Sandy approached. And yes, it was worse than tacky to run a segment on how major storms are great for the economy as the storm was making landfall. But that's live TV. A producer has to fill air. All in all, the PhDs over at the Weather Channel did an excellent job describing the shifting elements of a complex storm. I was struck in particular by one of these descriptions. A satellite image of Manhattan appeared on the screen, and we were told that the bump at the southeast part of the island was being reclaimed by the water. The word reclaim came up more than once to describe the rising tide. It's a revealing word, more narrative than simply descriptive. It hints at some larger backstory, some plot twist in the longer saga about our claims and the water's counterclaims to the earth. It isn't an accident that we give human names to our storms, that we regard them as identifiable characters. Aren't Hugo and Andrew and Katrina now minor deities, monsters in some of our central sagas? In that word reclaim, there's an echo of an old suspicion, most familiarly expressed in the story of Noah's Ark, that our world was first made of water, and if we fell our right to it, we might return to that state. We've been telling these stories for as long as we've been telling stories. There have always been storms. But there seems to be a special angst and urgency in the way we receive them today. There are those who believe that the singular story of our time is, or will be, a flood saga. The story was already ancient when it was adapted to the biblical text, which is to say it records a very old fear. Like all the fears, it has an uncanny feel of a vivid memory. It may be a memory of an actual flood in an actual Sumerian city, Shurapal, in circa 2800 BCE. In fact, it may even be older than that. Perhaps it's a fear that lingers from our earliest memories as a species that the waters from which we escape will one day come back for us and reclaim us. That's perhaps why, in later Greek version of the flood saga, Plato mentions it, and it was in wide circulation in the classical Greek world, the goddess took pity on Deucalion and Pyrrha and offered them some survivor therapy. Walk forward, she said, and throw the bones of your mother behind you. Deucalion correctly interprets the oracle to mean they should throw stones, i.e. the bones of their earth mother, behind them as they walk. These stones turn into people, and thus humans reclaim the earth. We post-Freudians can't help but hear developmental insight in the oracle. Excavate the bones of your past, your trauma, put them behind you, proceed forward. The water didn't consume you, says the goddess, but do not let the traumatic memory stunt you either. That's the old fear of the sea recorded in early written text. Fire destroys utterly, fire erases, sea reverses. This fear of deluge isn't just a destruction, but a kind of regression. The sea can drag us, everything on land and indeed dry land itself, back to a dreadfully early state. The deluge is terrifying, not just for its destructive capacity, but both for the way it undoes everything that has been accomplished, brings us back to the fathomless chaos of beginning. Is it any wonder that poor blameless Noah emerges from his boat, gets crazy drunk, and commits a horrible taboo act, literally unspeakable? The story edits out the details. He has no idea how to behave. At age 600 and something, he's got to learn to live again as a Homo sapien. Unfortunately for Noah, the Israelites skipped over the goddess in their story. So he doesn't get the kind of trauma therapy that Themis provided for Deucalion and Pyrrha. Noah and his unnamed wife had only a single, rather prickly god who cut them a new contract, commanded them to rebuild, and sent them on their way. The Sumerian flood texts that preceded the Noah story were court narratives, propaganda. The basic elements of these stories, the anger of the god, the man who warned of the flood, fashions a boat, seals it with pitch, invites some other species aboard, washes up on a mountaintop, the dispatching of scouts in the form of birds, are familiar to anyone who's read the biblical story of Noah. That is because the Noah story is probably an adaptation of sagas already long in circulation. The earliest written versions, a Sumerian poem etched in a tablet around 1600 BCE, though it is said to be an even older story. The flood survival story is an explicitly political tableau celebrating the staying power of the ruler, the ability of his regime to survive the absolute worst that the gods can impose on earth and flourish in the rebuilding process. Unlike Noah and every man, these earlier flood survivors were identified as political leaders. The image of the man emerging from his sealed boat, as from a tomb, as Christians would later point out, was in the earliest text the image of the human sovereign unscathed, strong as ever, ready to impose his governing will as before, stronger than before. The flood story works as political propaganda because it's strangely plausible, as a ring of common sense 5-point plan. The argument isn't that the leader is as powerful as a god or even close, but only that he's wily, politically savvy, and competent that he can negotiate the god's wrath. His solutions are simple and indeed human: build a boat. And that's the point. When the storm comes, as it will, his solutions are persuasive to the public and precisely foreseen and practical. A Hindu flood narrative concerning a survivor named Manu may also have political dimensions. To it, Manu, whose name connotes ruler, was a tax collector and legislator. In contrast with the biblical story, the Hindu narrative shrewdly knows that the story of post-flood political reemergence will be replayed endlessly by countless Manus throughout time. The ancient link between political propaganda and storms stubbornly persists into our day. We know from Katrina and Bush, now Sandy and Obama, how much is at stake in the chief creating of a compelling official post-storm narrative. After the deluge, the ruler must successfully craft this public story or suffer the consequences. We got a glimpse of court propaganda in Obama surveying the wreckage in Marine One and ordering in the C-130s. In contrast with the footage of Mitt Romney, the man without an office, packing up canned corn. Obama had the full power of the executive narrative-making machinery, and he put it on display for us. That's a bit like what those ancients were doing when they brought their man out of his executive ship in dramatic fashion. Political drama was especially complex in the earliest narratives. While the human ruler was exalted, the divine executive was harshly criticized. Both the Babylonian god Enlil in the Atrahasis epic, a story that shares a source with the better-known Epic of Gilgamesh, and Ovid's Jupiter consulted their counselors and their ruling councils before sending the storm waters. The storm was preceded by maneuvering and plenty of resistance from within the god's own parties. The great storm in the early epics is mostly the fault of the chief god, his abuse of power. There is even a class element in these stories. The god Enlil must consider the anti-flood argument that killing humanity would be economically ruinous. Humans, according to the epic, were created to serve as Earth's laboring class, necessary for gods to maintain their plush lifestyle. But let's return to the Bible's version, for it is the single wicked twist that the biblical scribes emphasized in their adaptation that lingers with us now, the wholesale and unequivocal indictment of humanity. Perhaps the God of Genesis was still learning about human nature. Maybe he himself was still young and impetuous back then, and at times even hot-tempered. He does seem to regret his actions at the end, but the story neither questions the deity's motives nor his right to annihilate mortals if they break the rules. On the contrary, in the Genesis deluge, humans got exactly what they had coming to them. The upshot of the biblical story, as opposed to the earlier narratives, is just that. The actions of human beings are entirely to blame for storms that destroy us. Implicit in this story is a radical and rather insane notion that there's a moral cause and effect to everything, even bad weather. This is an odd and troubling idea for us. It's the kind of story that smacks of the rhetoric used by those who would blame 9/11 on gay marriage. We'd like to think we've long outlived that kind of thinking. Nevertheless, a version of it is with us. One of the important discussions in the wake of Sandy is the culpability for the deluge, the future deluges, for the big one, hence climate change. After the storm, the ruler gives his story celebrating the strength of his regime. This is inevitable and perhaps necessary version of it. But there's another version of the story, the one that's anxiously circulating now among many people, echoes the one from the book of Genesis. The version says that we aren't just victims or heroes of the storm, but its perpetrators. Our basic claims to the dry earth is conditional on our behavior. We cannot simply rebuild, but must change our ways. And if we don't, the waters will reclaim the land. Listen closely and you'll hear this old unsettling story. It is returned, they say, with a vengeance. Okay, so I'm going to stop the share of that and go back to our PowerPoint here. Let me just see. I hope it doesn't go back to the beginning. Good. Okay, sometimes they do. All right, so we just talked about that. All right, so meanings of the flood. So what do we talk about in Steinberg? He talks about the way that water regresses us, that it provides a regression, that flood represents a trauma. It's the idea of someone who has built up their life and then reaches a point where everything comes crashing down and they have to start all over again. Okay, it's about how we rebuild after everything has been destroyed. Okay, and another story that demonstrates this is within the Odyssey. Odysseus is the Trojan War hero. He's on trying to get home. He's continually thwarted by Poseidon because Poseidon's angry at him for injuring his son, who is the Cyclops. And so he is, he goes from island to island. He can't get home. And eventually he's stranded on an island with a nymph called Calypso. who apparently gives him just about everything he wants, luxurious life, sex, everything, but he's not happy because he wants to be home in Ithaca with his wife, Penelope. But finally, Athena and Hermaeus come and they say to him, okay, Zeus says it's time. You need to build a boat, build a raft, get some provisions. They tell Calypso, look, it's time for him to go. You're going to have to. And she's not happy, but, the gods have said it. She's got to go along with it. And then he goes off. And as he's floating along, Poseidon has been away. They said he was at a celebration in Ethiopia or something. And he realizes that Odysseus is now escaping from the island. And he's furious. So he sends a massive tidal wave. And the only thing that saves Odysseus from drowning in this is the nymph Ino gives him her veil. And by hanging on to her veil, he's able to live. But he's washed up on the shore of the island of Sherry. And he's like this old man, this great Trojan hero who's a king and who amassed all this fortune and had everything. And now he's got nothing. And he's laying naked on this beach. And this is the moment that the princess Nausicaa comes out to do her laundry, which is kind of weird when you think about it. But she's this 12-year-old girl out doing her laundry, and she sees this naked man, and he has to appeal to her. So now he's resorting to having to appeal for help to a 12-year-old girl, who then gives him something to cover himself and then takes him to see her mother. Interesting, right? Going back to the mother, there's this idea of rebirth. And so from this, Odysseus has to undergo a new strategy and he lives a new way. So, so you see this idea of regeneration. Now, some other meanings of the flood that we're talking about here, the flood is the overwhelming of consciousness. In Jungian talk about schizophrenia, the consciousness is said to be flooded by the collective unconscious. There's no way for the ego to assert itself, to be its own little boat, to stay afloat. Okay. So water is often used as a metaphor for the collective. When we talk about the deep being swallowed by the whale in the deep, for example, or, the sea monster, there's this idea that we go back to the creation story and the monstrous serpents that one has to battle. It's that battle for consciousness. Okay. And this connects in with that. It's this idea that, we have our little dry lands, our means of staying afloat, but we always have to worry. We don't want to let the water overwhelm us. Okay. Now, again, in my second point, I talk about the flood as renewing and purifying. It can reverse, as we've noted, but it's also used as a purifier. You use water in baptism, for example. You wash water, this idea of washing something away. And that's also the element of these flood stories. Here's corruption. We're going to wipe it clean. We're going to wash it out. And now it's going to be, nice and new, just like bathing makes you clean and so forth. There's this sense of purifying. And yeah, of course, the theme of returning to chaos, going from order to disorder again. So there is a need on both the psychological level and on the external level to return things to some kind of what we think of as order or normalcy. Okay. And as Steinberg mentions, throw the bones behind you, move forward, and don't let yourself be overwhelmed by trauma. So water tends to represent that very, very potent force. It has to do with the deep, of things that are in the deep and the way in which we encounter them. Even if these stories refer to a literal flood in some fashion, it may not be, there's much, I think it would be a mistake to stop with that. There's a much deeper meaning here. And it's also worth noting some of the other associations with water. Anybody who, water is frequently associated with the emotional. If you read tarot, the suit of cups is associated with water, and it's frequently the pouring and the flowing of water. The temperance card is the angel with one foot on the land and one in the water, pouring the two. The idea is that you're integrating, those two things, that you're keeping things in balance, keeping your emotions in proper check, right? And so it's the way in which the emotional can overwhelm us. This is probably the way in which the rational became sort of the, that was the thing that we had, that's the, rationality we've kind of, as the superior tool, I guess that's searching for the right phrase here, the superior tool that we have as humans that sets us above others. We can rationalize things out. And that's also implied by Steinberg's article here, the idea of the king who can think on his feet and in this cataclysmic situation, I can aha, I reasoned out the answer. The very sensible 5-point plan, right? And this is also one of the reasons we tend to devalue emotion, because we think of it as something that is harmful to us. We think of it as emotion, like, oh, and when somebody's too emotional, then they're not thinking clearly. People can act, crimes of passion, things that people can do in the wake of being overwhelmed by emotion, or like I said, in the case of the the schizophrenic, being overwhelmed by the unconscious. If you go back to what we talked about in lecture 1 with the Heinrich Fears story of the woman who was, in complete state of schizophrenia for years and unable to come out of it until she started drawing. There had to be some kind of like way of reconnecting that linguistic rational piece that creates meaning in the middle of this frozen nothing. There's nothing, and in that case, she was talking about the emotions as being water as being frozen, which is another angle to consider there. And now there's the morality of the tale. What represents a corruption severe enough for the gods to want to wipe out humanity? In the Bible, it's interesting because the corruption has more to do with the fact that angelic or superior beings mated with humans and produced these beings that, again, depending on the account, the book of Enoch and some of the more apocryphal accounts refer to them as giants. And so you are, so this idea of these giants that are overrunning everything, and the only way to stop them is to just wipe them out. Okay, in others, it's the idea of human beings becoming wicked. Hesiod talks about the 4 ages of man. Ovid talks about 5, and it's usually the age of gold, the age of silver, the age of bronze, and the age of iron. Okay. And it's funny because even Hesiod back in his day considered himself to be living in the age of iron when men were the most wicked. And interestingly, archaeologically, we talk about those different ages. But the golden age, of course, is the one where, humans were like the immortals and lived with the gods. And they said the people from the ages of gold and perhaps silver were the ones who were now watched over humankind after that point, according to one story. Ovid gives the same 4, but he also throws in right around the Bronze Age, the Age of Heroes. And that may be the reference that we see here that goes back to this idea of the Nephilim as being the heroes, these demigods who take over the earth and who are the kings. Okay, but but this idea of the morality of it, the corruption, because Hesiod in his day says humankind's at its worst, it's never going to survive. And that was like in what, 700 BCE, 800 BCE. I mean, that's a few thousand years ago now. I mean, it's a while. And so it's interesting how the more we start to think about human behavior and civility and rationality, the more you start to think about it in social terms, in the idea of what's proper behavior for society, or what's proper behavior, what's your proper role, Confucian terms, what's your proper role, what's your proper social role, what are you supposed to do, or the Hindu idea of dharma, what your duty is to society, to your family. What kind of responsibility do we bear? And of course, if we want to look at it in a more literal sense, if we look at the climate crisis and what's been happening with hurricanes, rising sea levels, ice caps melting, things like that, again, what kind of responsibility do we have in that? And what can we do about it? In some respects, the idea of human responsibility comes out of the idea that that biblical idea that humans are the caretakers of the earth, that have dominion over all the animals and everything. And I don't know if that's 100% true. I mean, it's very clear that our actions, our carbon emissions and all of this stuff are actually causing this. Although people also say, cows farting causing the problem too. And I'm like, well, I don't know how you're going to solve that. People say, don't eat meat. I'm like, okay. As one of the comedians said, he said, I figured by eating cow, you would solve the problem. But, it's, I don't want to oversimplify the question of the problem. It's very clear that a lot of the effects are coming from the stuff that we're doing to run our stuff, our electrical systems, our fossil fuels, our emissions, like all of that is contributing to the problem. So yes, we do have some level of responsibility. But there's also at another level where there's just things that we like to think we have control, or that we have rationality and we have science. And yes, well, we can control all of this. And the reality is that you can't. And that's another level of this idea of the fear of the flood, of what's going to reclaim us. So that's going to be it for this week. That's about as much as I want to say about the flood myths. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll get on to the next topic next week. Take care.